An astonishing treasure trove of trains hidden in the heart of Africa.
It's like a train graveyard, with shrubs and earth gradually burying the remains.
A mystical complex of structures shrouded in intrigue.
Skulls have been found at this site, but they're not to do with burials. It's believed these were taken as trophies.
And vast relics of industry rusting in the American Midwest.
This is just a small part of what was here. Shows you the scale of this facility.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, forged through years of toil, now haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the peaceful shores of Lake Michigan, in the heart of the American Midwest, stands a series of sites with an intriguing past.
There's not much left in the way of clues to tell you what it was for. Clearly, when the site was abandoned, it was stripped bare.
This place has a top secret feel to it. You know, you see the remains of fencing topped with barbed wire, you see control towers of some kind.
Why do we have plinths and platforms with nothing on them?
And that, in turn, begs the question, so what were these things for?
A scope of the surrounding area reveals something more perplexing. The remnants of a second related site lie covered in undergrowth.
This site is, if anything, even more mysterious. You just have this large concrete pad and then these steel doors that open to something underground, but you can't see what.
What was so deadly that it was kept underground at this disturbing site in Indiana? And what links these two compounds to one of the most perilous periods of American history? Local entrepreneur Virgil Frey is keen to preserve the long-forgotten buildings of this cryptic site. Vestiges of a barrack suggest it was some kind of military center back in the 1950s.
This is the part of the property that housed over 90 men when it was an active base. We have 17 full buildings. The admin building, that's where the commander would have been. We have 2 full barracks buildings. We have a mess hall. We have a generator room that produced power for the base.
The true purpose of this place was a well-guarded secret.
All 23 acres were surrounded by barbed wire. There were dogs, there were kennels, and extra security that would be here. The general public knew very little about the property or what went on here at the time.
One building on the site explains this level of security.
So this is the communications building. So this building would have housed racks and racks of computers.
This provides a clue to what would have once topped the site's 5 looming towers.
So each one of these towers housed a different set of radar. When the base was active, there was dishes along the top of that tower. The key elements of the property were really gathering the information from the towers, putting that together in the communications room.
So the towers themselves are essentially platforms for radar arrays and communication systems.
But what was this highly sophisticated surveillance system designed to detect? The answer can be found almost a mile away at a second, more remote site, with its ominous-looking doors in the ground.
What we're looking at here is the command and control center for an installation of very sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles.
This pair of derelict sites worked in tandem. The first site was a listening station and control center.
The radar sets will relay the coordinates over to the launch site where the missiles will be prepared. There's 3 of them behind these steel doors.
The missiles launched from the second site were interceptors, designed to take out invading enemy aircraft. But why would anyone want to attack the American Midwest? A clue sits 10 miles away from the missile sites, in a vast industrial wasteland.
These two areas of abandoned infrastructure are linked in history. This whole region is full of this kind of abandoned infrastructure on a very large scale.
It looks like some post-apocalyptic vision.
What is the connection between these sites? And did the same thing destroy all of them?
The answer lies in the history of this derelict place. 50 years ago, it was a hive of activity.
This was really the beating heart of American industry, this whole new industrial zone created along the shores of Lake Michigan near Chicago.
And this is the town of Gary, Indiana, once dubbed the city of the century. The colossal scale of this place was born out of one hugely prized product: steel.
When U.S. Steel set up shop on the banks of Lake Michigan in 1906, that was really the start of Gary's rise to being an industrial powerhouse and a region of enormous strategic importance to the country. It was vitally important for the military as well.
And in World War II, the steelworks at Gary are producing all the steel needed for, ships, planes, tanks, and all the, armaments of war. Gary is chosen as an industrial site for many reasons. One of them is that it's immune to enemy attack because it's so far inland.
You could not fly a plane from Germany or Japan or Russia to bomb Gary, Indiana.
But after the Second World War, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union drove a fast-paced race for technological and military supremacy. And the USSR soon came up with a long-range, high-flying bomber.
If the Soviets had ordered an attack on America, big Soviet bomber aircraft filled with nuclear weapons, escorted by regiment after regiment of fighter aircraft, would have crossed north over the pole and moved south towards the American heartland. It starts to become possible to nuke Gary.
The launch and control sites now sinking into the Indiana shrubland date back to that time, when 150 million Americans were suddenly living within range of Soviet nuclear warheads. The U.S. military had to defend the American heartland, but did these overgrown sites live up to the job? In the 1950s, this pair of dilapidated sites concealed the capability to blast state-of-the-art Soviet bombers out of the sky. These are the remains of the Nike missile project.
These Nike missiles were regarded as really the ultimate defensive measure against the ultimate Soviet weapon at the time, the heavy bomber coming in over the North Pole.
There were more than 20 paired Nike missile sites in the Lake Michigan area. This pair is Nike C-47. Together, they were designed to defend Gary, Indiana. And the dilapidated communication room was mission control.
So should the decision have been made to actually launch a missile, this is where it would have happened from. The missile that they would have been firing obviously needs to strike that target, or a lot of people's lives are on the line. I couldn't imagine how it must have felt to have to actually make those decisions. I'm sure it would have been tense at that moment.
If you're a missile operator or radar operator in an installation like this, you really just get one shot at it.
And if they were asleep at the switch, people could die.
But the advance of the Cold War technology race meant that the missiles of Nike C-47 were never called into action.
Even as they were being built, the technology was changing and the threat was changing.
In the 1960s, the Soviet Union develops intercontinental ballistic missiles.
There was no real defense against an intercontinental ballistic missile. That warhead would be coming in from space at supersonic speeds.
Suddenly, this cutting-edge defensive weapon is no longer useful. And so what we see here in the land around Gary is just a moment in that history.
And in the coming decades, the industry of Gary, Indiana, would also be rendered obsolete, not at the hands of communism, but capitalist markets.
Nobody had to blow it up with a nuclear weapon. The realities of economics and politics changed Gary into the rubble we see there today. These missile bases were very much part of the story of Gary, Indiana, just as much as those big factories.
Today, beyond the industrial wasteland, encroaching undergrowth engulfs the once cutting-edge defense system.
The place is a real monument to the pace of technological change during the Cold War.
In the north of England, a collection of crumbling structures once marked the edge of the known world.
Britain represented something that was unknown, barbaric. It was a place of myth and speculation and mystery.
Here and there, you see the remnants of stone foundations that suggest something significant was built here.
This site is located amongst a sort of network of streams and waterways. It could have sustained quite a lot of people living there.
But any trace of those who walked these stone pathways has long since vanished.
Whoever built this put a lot of engineering, ingenuity, and craftsmanship into building this. That you have a commanding view of the whole region, which suggests that it had military importance. We're less than a mile from a major defensive structure.
The vast wall was designed to protect those in the south from the people to the north. But the question this poses is, who were these people to the north of the wall?
Evidence suggests that beyond this wall lived a feared, painted people.
This is really venturing into the dark and mysterious. And you could imagine that it would have been both exciting, but also quite scary.
Further excavation reveals oppression and treachery were at play here.
Skulls have been found at this site, but they're not to do with burials. It's believed these were taken as trophies. These foundations are just the surface. Underneath is an epic and bloody history.
What links the monumental wall that cuts through the wilds of northern England to this eerie, abandoned place? This ancient site is known as Vindolanda. Archaeologist Andrew Burley has spent his life figuring out what went on here, like his father and grandfather before him.
It's given up a huge number of its secrets. And those secrets have changed our perceptions. The more and more work we do, the more we start to understand about what happened here almost 2,000 years ago.
Relics of walls, broken steps, and remnants of strange foundations provide the barest outline of what once stood here.
This building here, it's got about 20 rooms on the ground floor. Really, really impressive.
Digging deep between these desolate ruins, Andrew's father unearthed an incredible clue as to who lived here.
We found the remains of a bonfire site. And included on that bonfire was something like 320 or 30 letters, documents.
Who carved out these ancient words 2 millennia ago? And why did they vanish? On a windy outcrop in northern England, the ancient ruins of Vindolanda are giving up tantalizing secrets from the past. The biggest indication as to who built this site lies not within it, but scattered all around.
And nearby, you've got this long, straight road running from east to west, and that might give us an indication as to who built this and why.
Back then, the only people to build roads like this were the Romans.
I'm standing here on one of the major Roman roads, and on either side of me, solid walls of stone, solid pavement of stone, and a very big door at the far end.
The location of Vindolanda indicates a military purpose. Vindolanda sits on the border between England and Scotland, at the northern edge of the Roman Empire, which once spread from northern Britain to the Middle East.
So Vindolanda was a frontier conquest fort. So when the Roman army conquered this part of the landscape, they put a fort down here as part of something called the Roman frontier.
So wherever you go inside this fort, you're reminded of structure, rank, status, and the huge impact of Rome.
For the Romans, Britain was beyond the known world. It was a land of mystery. It was a land where things were unknown. It was a place where they speculated about myth and mystery.
They were especially terrified of the warring barbarians of the north.
The Romans called the people north of the wall the painted people, Picti, from where we get the word Picts. They thought they were deeply uncivilized, but respected them as great and fearsome warriors.
Evidence of how the Romans tried to control the northern tribes lies within sight of Vindolanda.
As you sort of rise up and look into the distance, you can see the walls snaking along the landscape, using every sort of nook and cranny of the landscape to help fortify its protection.
The vast wall runs across the whole of northern Britain, from coast to coast.
This extraordinary 73-mile-long construction is Hadrian's Wall. It was built by one of Rome's most ruthless emperors.
Hadrian was a volatile character. It's said that his boyfriend jumped into the river, but many also said that it was Hadrian who pushed him.
And when Hadrian came to Britain in 122 AD, he was determined that the northern tribes would not get the better of him.
So here we are at Hadrian's Wall, created by 15,000 Roman soldiers in a decade of hard work, sweat, and tears, separating out people on this side, part of the Roman Empire, for the other side, the barbarians to the north.
Large parts of it are built using the landscape as part of the defense. There's a big structure along large parts of the wall called the wind sill. So you've not only got Hadrian's Wall to contend with, you've got this cliff of rock. And what a formidable thing to try and get past.
The configuration of the site reveals how Hadrian's Wall was designed to subjugate the rebellious Picts.
What we're looking at here is the power of the Roman Empire to impose its will on a landscape, on a people.
Imagine this twice the height, with a walkway, crenellations across the top. And even at nighttime, this would be so visible in the landscape. It would also be a wall of light. The soldiers with their torches would run across the top, giving you this contrast between what's inside the Roman Empire and what's outside.
For those people who were looking at it from the north, on seeing this cutting-edge Roman military fortification, it must have been the most awe-inspiring sight, unlike anything they'd ever seen.
Hadrian's Wall was the most unconquerable defense system in the world at the time.
So every mile, you get two towers, which command tremendous views right across as far as the eye can see to the north, 30, 40 miles in some places. Nothing can get under the Roman radar.
The Romans built 16 defensive forts along the wall to keep the northern hordes at bay. But the stone ruins at Vindolanda don't fit this story. The sprawling fortress sits a mile away from Hadrian's Wall. So was the unprecedented wall strong enough to protect the ancient letter writers who lived here? Or did they fall victim to the marauding Picts? Ruins of the Roman fort of Vindolanda in northern England show that 2,000 years ago, this place was thriving.
The population numbers alone at this site range from 2,500 to 6,000 or 7,000 people.
You had people from what is today Belgium, people from modern Germany, people from Switzerland, even North Africa, living and patrolling this area.
Rubble at the site reveals that Vindolanda was actually split into two parts, the fort itself and a bustling Roman town. In their downtime, the soldiers manning Hadrian's Wall retreated to Vindolanda.
This was more like a small city. People were there with their wives and their children, and they were involved in farming and hunting and all kinds of activities. So it was more like a community than simply a military facility.
By the 4th century, the Romans were severely overstretched and no longer had the appetite for faraway wars. Their vast empire declined, and so did Vindolanda. The ancient letters found here were hastily destroyed by the Romans as they retreated.
They'd lit the bonfire, the rain had come along and put the bonfire out and made it impossible to burn. And then 2,000 years later, we find the site of that bonfire, and all the letters are still sitting there in a heap. And what they talk about is just sensational. Everything from demands for beer to birthday party invitations. They give the color and the detail, the shades of gray to life at Vindolanda.
Today, Vindolanda and Hadrian's Wall stand as a reminder of the hubris and ambition of the Roman Empire.
We can look at it as an incredible monument to military architecture, the will of an empire, but also you can see it as a monument to failure, a monument to the fact that the Roman army never finished the job. They couldn't quite beat everybody in Britain.
In the Horn of Africa, in eastern Ethiopia, the city of Dire Dawa harbors a site crowded with relics that have hit the end of the line.
It's a ghostly site that was clearly once full of life, but is now abandoned, with all the people that were here mysteriously missing. There's something really quite spooky about it.
A closer inspection of this corroding place reveals European fingerprints all over it.
We're in Ethiopia, but we've got French signs hanging up. We've got locomotives abandoned. We've got bits of rolling stock and lines.
A giant tooling shed, musty with dust and oil, brimming with 50-year-old lathes, and a brightly coloured painted ticket office, now empty. The once vibrant paint peeling from its walls.
If this place was once part of a railroad, it was clearly the epicenter of a significant network.
Looking at the scale of this place, a huge amount of capital was invested. And now we see it covered in grime.
It's a place where train enthusiasts would love to explore. There are the trains, there are the signs. There's just a sense of history.
Usually when a rail line is decommissioned, the cars and equipment are sold off. But this hub has remained, and the trains left abandoned. So what's their story?
The story of this train graveyard can be traced back to the end of the 19th century, to the vision of one man, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia.
Ethiopia is a landlocked, barren state, but it has huge amounts of natural resources. But they're only going to help the people if they can be exploited. And at the turn of the 20th century, the emperor looked around and thought, how are other countries succeeding and moving forward?
If you look at Britain or America in the 19th century, what was the game changer? It was all about urbanization and industrialization. And at the heart of that were the railways.
Emperor Menelik really wanted to put Ethiopia on the map with an impressive engineering project, and that was the railroad.
Menelik's railroad would connect the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, and other major trading centers to the Red Sea port of Djibouti.
This provided a direct link to the coast where goods could be exported.
This site is the remains of the Dire Dawa railway terminus, once pivotal to Emperor Menelik's Ethio-Djibouti Railway. But whoever built this place left behind a distinctly European feel. 67-year-old Basha Ali Omer has worked here all his life. He knows how to decode the mysteries of this junkyard site. His ability to speak French provides the first clue.
Once we'd learned that language, we could come here and get a job. We could work here then, because everything the company did was done in French. So here we have the accounting office, case office, and an inspector bureau. All of these are written in French.
Back when Menelik II conceived the Ethio-Djibouti Railway, European powers vied for control of Africa. Menelik had just seen off an Italian attempted invasion, so decided to grant the concession to build his railroad to the French.
The French came in to set up Ethiopia's railways, and in 1897 they made a great start.
The terminus at Dire Dawa opened in 1904, and the city began to grow.
Dire Dawa was founded because of this railway, which carried both freight and passengers through here. It transported commodities like cereals from Addis Ababa and delivered them to Dire Dawa. Then it went back to Djibouti and transported goods back to the port.
Dire Dawa had been a backwater. What the railroad does is it transforms it into a hub that goods and people are going through.
What we see here has been repeated all across the world. You get a small village, but in the right place, and you put a railway through it. And suddenly that village becomes bigger and bigger until you get a bustling town supporting not only the railway, but driving business, driving the economy.
When the line was finally completed, 4 years after Menelik's death, a once treacherous journey of many weeks could now be made safely in 36 hours.
It took a while, but by 1917, Ethiopia had a bustling, thriving railway network, ready to be exploited by people and goods. At its peak, nearly 4,000 passengers and 1,250 tons of cargo would pass through this station every single day.
Racial segregation that was commonplace in many countries at the time wasn't tolerated in Ethiopia. And so you had Europeans and Africans sharing common areas on the passenger train. Hundreds of people, black and white, traveling from here every day, all together.
Menelik's vision for Ethiopia was ahead of its time, but the skeletons in this train graveyard suggest that the emperor's plan did not turn out as he dreamed. Deep in the heart of Ethiopia lies the remains of the Dire Dawa Railroad Station. 100 years ago, it was a thriving transport hub. So where did it all go wrong?
World War II truly was a global war, and Ethiopia didn't escape. The railway and the country were overtaken by Italian fascists, and they used the railway network to transport people, goods, and weapons, including tanks, using the railway system.
In 1941, Ethiopia was liberated by the Allied forces, but the railroad still didn't revive.
The end of World War II triggered a global recession. The railway line in particular fell into disrepair, it limped along, but there was no reinvestment.
The railway suffered another blow in 1977. As Somali troops invaded Ethiopia, they took control of the railway and Dire station. They blew up large portions of the railway, meaning operations were again cut in half.
To add to this, in 1985, a terrible accident shook Ethiopia.
A train was crossing a river on a curved bridge and derailed. And out of the 1,000 people on board, 400 people died. This is the worst rail accident that Africa has ever suffered, and it's had a major effect on the network.
Today, a brand new line runs alongside the old railroad, and the station at Dire Dawa is no longer needed. The Ethio-Djibouti Railway represents a national dream which may yet be revived.
Plans are now afoot to reinvigorate Ethiopia's rail network, which the government hopes will kickstart industrialization, transforming a poor agricultural nation of nearly 100 million people into a middle-income country by 2025.
In Eastern Europe, in the heart of Lithuania, lies a ring of ruins that at first sight seems to make little sense.
If you were to be dropped into the middle of this space, because of its vastness, it wouldn't really make sense as to what it actually is.
This is one of those structures that you get a better idea from the air. You can see angular shapes, you can see the outlines of buildings.
On the ground, a series of mysterious features emerge.
It's overgrown, there are plants everywhere, and there are these concrete mounds with large openings, but it's not clear where they lead to.
You see long tunnels, many of them sloping and going in different directions. You see something of a dark interior maze.
It's thick black, and the smell is kind of damp and mossy, and it's actually a really spooky place.
Signs of violent struggle linger ominously all around.
This place clearly suffered from a major attack.
The sense of damage and devastation is obvious.
There are holes in the ceilings, holes in the walls, and just debris everywhere.
When you find out what really happened here, it just sends a chill down your spine.
The origins of this vast ruin date to a turbulent and bloody period of European history.
What happened in this place was very, very significant and helped push the downfall of a great empire.
In the late 1800s, the area where this site is located was under Russian rule. As the end of the century approached, tensions between Europe's superpowers were mounting, and this borderland region was the first to feel the heat.
Germany, which had always been separated into smaller kingdoms and states, finally unified in 1871. And for the first time in its history, the Russian Empire now had a single, powerful nation on its western border.
And when Germany got a new emperor in 1888, he was no longer interested in the old alliance with Russia. In anticipation of war, the Russians built this, the fortress of Kaunas.
The Russian Tsar likes fortifications, so this idea of fortress cities comes into being, and Russia will pour in a lot of its military wealth.
In 1882, construction began. Valdas Rakutis is a local historian fascinated by this structure's gory past.
Kaunas Fortress is one of the biggest fortresses of Russian Empire in the Europe. And the rear part of the fort were used for the soldiers, 250, which live here and fight here in the time of war.
This was the golden age of fortress building. This is really the last time you see wide-scale, large-scale building of fortresses.
So we are on the right side of the fort, and you can see the city of Kaunas, which this fort protects.
Basically, all roads lead to the city. You couldn't go around it. But the most important thing was that it was a rail nexus. And rail was the way to move troops and supplies in this period of warfare.
Kaunas was so vital, the Russians didn't stop at one fort. They built 9.
You need to set up your fortifications so there's no safe approaches, so that every direction is covered.
When they were built, they were pretty much state-of-the-art, but the state-of-the-art in the late 1890s was changing very rapidly.
Every couple of years, this fortress had to be updated because within that short space of time, technology was progressing, artillery was changing, and the threats were becoming more and more dangerous.
Pretty soon, new weapons, airplanes, tanks, they're going to make fixed fortifications largely obsolete.
And when the First World War broke out across Europe, the 20th century's new weapons of war would put the imperious fort to the test. In the First World War, the bitter conflict between two of Europe's great superpowers was focused on the Lithuanian fortress town of Kaunas. The Germans put all their might behind conquering the coveted fortress.
The Germans poured reinforcements into the northern part of their flank, and they moved down. And by August of 1915, they're now at the gates of Kaunas.
For 10 days, hell rained down on Forts 1, 2, and 3. But Fort 4 was supposed to be the toughest, really the hardest nut to crack. And the Russians were hoping the Germans would focus their efforts there, but they didn't.
In the First World War, if you lost 1 or 2 forts, it means that fortress is still alive. But everything depends on the sensitive points of the fort. If your sensitive points will be destroyed, your fortress will be broken.
With the German army bearing down and supported by superior weaponry, the weaker sections of the fortress didn't stand a chance.
The most terrifying of these new weapons was an artillery piece called Big Bertha, and it fired a 17-inch artillery shell. 17 inches! It was the largest artillery piece ever built.
We can see results of the bombardment. Destroyed completely such building. Of course, destroying all people who were close. No possibility to survive in such occasions.
Once that breach was made, the Germans flooded into the city and then took over. What is absolutely incredible is that all those years of planning and construction was not able to withstand a few days of concentrated attack.
The Germans held much of Lithuania until the war's bitter conclusion. But even after German withdrawal, the suffering didn't end.
When they left, there was a power vacuum, and you had to have 3 civil wars as Lithuania finally established itself as a separate nation. But as much as there was violence and horror there, the darkest days of the fortress were yet to come.
As Hitler's Nazi war machine trampled its enemies, this site bore witness to unspeakable horrors.
The forts are a perfect location for the perpetration of the worst of the German war crimes, particularly those against civilians. They're out of the way, they're hidden,
And that's exactly what made it, sadly, an ideal place for mass execution.
And Lithuania's Jewish population suffered the greatest cruelty.
Fort number 4 is important as place of Holocaust during the Second World War. And definitely in this place, people were transported sitting and waiting for the execution.
In a single day, over 1,800 Jews were shot here. Tragically, this genocide was echoed in the other forts around Kaunas.
Fort number 9 saw the worst of these crimes against humanity. Tens of thousands were murdered in and around the fort.
As the end of the war drew closer, for one final time, the forts would be used for their intended purpose. Here, the Nazis attempted to make a last stand against the advancing forces of Stalin's Russia.
These forts were useless against a massive Soviet tank force. And in fact, these fortresses that held out for 11 days in World War I fell in 45 minutes.
And then the Germans are driven out, but Lithuania isn't going to find the independence it struggled so hard to achieve before the war. Instead, they're going to be facing a new occupation, that of the Soviets, and that's going to last for another half century.
In 1990, after the Iron Curtain fell, Lithuania finally became an independent nation. Now, the abandoned forts serve as a reminder of this resilient nation's tumultuous past.
What can we find on this site today besides the remnants of these fortifications? We find a memorial to all the lives that were lost there under the German occupation.